So this is the week of the 4th, and we're dressing and having picnics and all that, just like we were on the 4th this Sunday, because it happened to be in Wednesday. But this is when we're celebrating our country. Essentially, its birthday, really, is what we're really celebrating, is its birthday. And like a lot of people who've grown up, we've done some things really well, and we've done things pretty badly. And so one of the things I noticed when I grew up in the Vietnam era, and so when patriotism comes along and it's flag-waving time, all I can remember, I can hardly never forget, let me put it that way, that I was of the generation that was asked to go to some third world country for our country because it was patriotic. And it always bugs me. And so patriotism got a fairly nuanced thing. And I didn't have to go. I had a draft number of 316, which meant I had no chance of going. I got that by being on my knees for a whole night before they drew the numbers that year. And I'm sure that's how it happened, but it was a tough thing. It's a tough thing. That it's a legacy that many of us my age have to deal with. Unlike my father, who was of the greatest generation, the one that went to Europe and helped liberate Europe from the Nazis, and in the East from the Japanese aggressors at the time. And so that generation has often been called the greatest generation because they weren't really prepared for this. The country wasn't really prepared to be a world leader. We had we certainly weren't one of the largest armies in the country, in the world at the time. We were just had a small isolationist type army, and so we had to ramp up, and it built up production in this country. It pulled us out of a depression. It moved us into the place of world leadership. As England faded from the front, we took their place, and we became the largest, most powerful country in the world. And we have remained that way since. And we, as people sitting in this room, have inherited the world that they gave to us. So we inherited a country that was much wealthier than it was before World War II. We inherited ideas that we are the world leader and we need to cooperate with the world. This is the country that had the Marshall Plan that put Europe back together again and helped restore Japan, its former enemy. We are the country that speaks about civil rights and about being essentially good citizens of the world. That has been our legacy that has come from this greatest generation. And yet, even in that time period, we have made silly mistakes that have been painful for both us and other places, like Vietnam. I think it's really interesting that the day on July 4th, we celebrate that this small third world country, which we were at the time, this small third world country was able to defeat one of the largest armies in the world, England, and then we had our hat handed to us in Vietnam in just the same way. So there's a symmetry here, and there's something to be learned about this, and it is the problem of being the top dog. That when you're the top dog, when you're the dominant force, it's easy to overlook that your real mission is not to extend your power so much as to extend your hand. Now, part of the problem, of course, is that we come from a culture based on the scriptures of Israel and Christianity, Judaism and Christianity. Those two foundational Abrahamic religions are our heritage. And Israel was always the smallest country in the Middle East, caught between big powers like Syria and Egypt, and so their writings are really about from a small country's perspective, and they are not always that generous, you know, as the weak are often need to be. They need to build themselves up to be strong, to be ferocious, etc. And Christianity came from being the stepsister of Judaism. They were a tiny sect, often persecuted, and much of the foundational thought around Christianity was from the underclass. One of the things that's odd is when a dominant society takes on a small society's writings to make themselves as their religion, which happened in 300. So the emperor of Rome decides he's going to take Christianity as his religion, and that becomes ascendant now. And with it, the Jewish scriptures as well. And so instead of being persecuted, now we become the dominant force, and we don't know how to deal with it. I don't think we know how to deal with it scripturally, which is part of the reason I don't read it much from this place. Because much of that I'd just like to throw out, right? I was trying to find something I could use today. I couldn't. I won't say that, but I basically, there's a lot you have to filter through. And part of what happened, of course, was as Europe became the ascendant powers in the world, it took Christianity and tried to impose it on people who were already doing okay, right? So, or at least in some ways quite disastrously, this power over came by controlling what they believed about themselves. And so this idea of sin and salvation became a great model for a domineering society. There's something wrong with you, we have the answer, right? It's part of the reason we don't use the sin salvation paradigm in unity, is we don't think there's something wrong with you, and we expect you to grow into your highest and fullest best. We don't expect you to obey, we expect you to become. Not what we tell you, but what you desire to be. It's the major difference. It's a very democratic idea, this thing called unity. But as a history, our culture that has come this far has used religion in beautiful ways, but also in some ways that we're embarrassed, should be embarrassed about. And so I was just reading, when America was discovered in 1492 by Columbus, in the Americas, in North America, there were 80 million Native Americans. 60 years later, there were 10 million. That's a big chunk. Mexico, 25 million. 70 years later, 150 years later, 1 million. So we talk about genocide in Europe with the Jews and the people that the Nazis exterminated with such horror and disgust. And yet we have in our heritage that. Now, most of us in this room can't fix it. That's for sure. And just carrying guilt around is not my idea of a good time. I don't think it's productive. I don't think it helps. But I do think it's really important to realize that this country's had essentially a genocide war against the natives that were here, and we've had slavery. And so we've had a couple of biggies that are ours, that are still have a persistent tail with us today. And I think if we are to ever be America the Great, that we have chosen to be and have strived to be for all these years, we need to also know where we are failing or where we have failed, and to make corrective actions when we can in an appropriate way. Right at this moment, I think one of the ways we're failing as a country is this. Now, if there's anybody in here who qualifies as the 1%, I want you to come see me afterwards. As I would like to assuage what I'm going to say. Essentially, you know that in the 9 years of the recovery that's been going on economically in this country, many, many jobs have been created, and right now we're at fairly low unemployment of those who are willing to work, or those who think they can get enough reasons to work from work. But much of that employment is at not the level that the people want. And unfortunately, wages have not gone up and appreciably in the last 10 or 15, well, actually 25 years, but in this recovery, wages have not yet started to rise. So against that relatively stagnant situation, somewhat definitely improved over 9 years ago, definitely much improved over 9 years ago, but fairly stagnant in wages. There's the contrasting fact that 60% of all the wealth that has been created in those last 9 years, 60% of all the wealth, so that's like 10% more than half. It's kind of hard to get 60%. 10% over half goes to 1% of the people. Not actually 1%, but 1/10 of 1%, but who wants to split hairs? 1% of the people are managing and controlling 60% of the wealth. Now, that's great for them, and that's why I'd like to see you when it's over, because the capacity you have if you're a 1%er is enormous, and with the magic of compound interest, you're put in a position where you could never lose if you're reasonable with your money. You're just you're on the highway to that not being your issue forever. But many of us are maybe getting to that place, but this is a standard of when 60%, that means like even the ones of us who are doing well are having to divide 40% among all of us. And maybe we're taking more than our share too, but more than the average share, but somebody's got 60 of it. You with me? It's like, I don't care how well you're doing, you have no idea how well they are doing. But it's almost in the category of who cares, except that in this country there are, 20% of the kids are living below the poverty level? Then it really matters. It really matters. And one of the things we have not tried to address is redistribution of wealth in a way that is both, it keeps the incentive to grow wealth and to become wealthy, and also to take care of those who need some help. We have lost our virtuous cycle that we used to have of redistributing it every once in a while, and the problem with this is, historically, if it doesn't come about in a peaceful way, it will come about in a bad way once enough people get upset about it. Or as Marie Antoinette said, they don't really like cake, They want more than that. And so there is a sense that we are being distracted by things that are not that important. And even though we might be doing our very best, we will look back on this time period if we don't make kind and appropriate and reasonable adjustments, wise adjustments. We may look back on this period with regret if we live that long. I'm not fomenting revolution here, and I don't think we should steal from the rich to give to the poor. But redistribution of some sort needs to take place, or we will have what I found in Latin America when I first started going there, which was that you have the wealthy and you have the poor, and the middle class is missing. And that's not healthy for us. It's not, in my opinion, it's not the American way. So just keep that in mind. Now, I always worry about saying something that it can be construed as political from this stage. I have no problem telling you in the privacy of my own home, but from this place, I'm pretty careful about it. But I do think Jesus was far less careful. Jesus just ripped him a new one all the time. And he did it not because he was just a political animal, but because it's part of spirituality, deep knowing of the divine, is to treat people with kindness and respect and love, and to do your best to make sure everybody has enough. This is what someone who sees God in everybody would do. Rather than leave them hungry and destitute, he would say something about it. And I think we as a culture, we as a unity culture, have been really good about searching for the inner meaning of life and finding our own true expression. That in almost every way, we have ignored this idea of speaking up politically. And I'm not making this a political speech. I'm just making this a speech about how do we find the closest thing to equity without disincentivizing our world. But how do we make a world that works for everyone? And part of that is economic. Another part of it then is spiritual, and I'd like to talk about that. So I'm really talking about outer world and inner world today. And since I've got you until we eat, I know you'll stick around for that. I'm going to do both. So let's talk about the inner world. One of the things we did last week up in the upper room with the people who were on the Sacred Prayer Circle is that we sat around in a circle, and I said, so what are you all thinking about these days? And much of the conversation was about what had been in the news, about at the border how children were being pulled from their parents' arms. And that image, and it was, I might have been the only guy in the room, I'm not sure. It might have been one or two others, but it was mostly women. And you could see that this was a visceral response for them. This was not, they were not protesting, they were not making this a story about somebody else. This was about the children and their mother and the suffering that's going on because of actions that are happening at the border. And so we did a prayer to help with this. Now the prayer we did was called Ho'oponopono, and many of you have heard me talk about that before, but Ho'oponopono has one underlying necessary fundamental thought behind it, and that is that what you see out there is actually in here also. That if you see it, it's yours. That the world is not separated by that and this, but that we're all in this together. And that to heal that out there, you don't have to go touch it. You just need to correct what's in here. You need to heal what's in here, fix this, and that will take care of itself. And I've told you stories of other people who, and myself, who've had that happen, but essentially that's the thought process. And so you say, I'm sorry. Not that you are doing it, actually. You're not the one separating families, but I'm sorry because I recognize, I take ownership that this is mine. I have that either as a potential or as a fact, but certainly as a thought form within me, I have that as well. It's a virus I've attained, just like what's happening out there. That suffering and the causing of that suffering, I have it within me. So both the ones who are losing and the ones who are doing the separating, I have that. I am that. This is radical. Granted, most of our life we don't talk that way. Certainly, much of our life we don't think that way. But when you do that, you begin to get close enough to the problem that you can fix it. So you claim it. And then you say, please take this virus from me. I'm sorry, please forgive me. And the forgive me means I would like to have this lifted out of my consciousness. I would like it released from my consciousness. Please forgive me means please take this from me. Right? And you won't, if you're like me, you won't say, please forgive me with all the earnestness it requires unless you have done the first thing, which is gone, oh my God, it's in me. Oh my God, that is me. And when you see that, you go on your kneesies, please forgive me. Take this from me. So we're sitting in this circle. And there's two more phases to it, thank you and I love you. But those don't come unless the first two happen. Not in real seriousness, I don't think. So we're sitting in this circle, and we close our eyes, and we start doing Ho'oponopono, and I start to say, I'm sorry, please forgive me. And it dawns on me, I am that guy. I am that guy taking this child from its mother. Now, it's not, obviously I wasn't at the border doing that, but I was. I have been in arguments. I have been in emotional contest with other people in which I took their child from them, their precious identity, their tender place, their themselves from them. I had separated them, their joy from themselves. I had done that. Especially to when, as an argument goes, sometimes people like me who like to win do our best to win. So suffering, I had caused suffering. And I got it so clearly, I started to weep. We, who are so righteous in our indignation about so much, could use all that indignation to point us to where we need to heal ourselves. We could look out on the world and go, the world is not being fair over here. The world is this, that, and the other. And if we will be deeply spiritual with that, we will say, I'm sorry. Please forgive me. I have the same. Please take it from me. And in that way, in a world in which we see too much injustice, we can take ownership of it to heal ourselves. Because once you ask that to be forgiven within you, and you will feel that release, that natural statement of thank you and I love you comes right out. Maybe not in that moment, but it comes because you have cleansed something within you. And so the world as we don't like it becomes our teacher of how we can be a holy being ourselves without carrying so much of this mental viruses that our world is infected with. So we have two ways of working in the world, and I think a whole and complete human being uses all his or her faculties to make it happen. We act in the world in such a way that we bring healing and peace and justice and possibilities to the most people we can. And we take ownership of everything that is before us as though it were our very own. And we don't come with arrogance and superiority. We come with the knowledge that, oh my God, me too. So since I'm not part of the 1%, I could say, oh, the 1% is really doing us wrong, but is that true? They're just doing what they can for themselves. And I would like to know when I have stopped doing that. That is what I do. I'm sorry. Please forgive me. Thank you, and I love you. It does not mean I don't think we should still fix this problem. But there's no gap between even me and the 1% who own 60% of everything. Right? So it's a complex thing to be a saint in this world, to be both spiritual to be practical, to be all that. I get it. It's not easy. But we can, if we choose, take the full mantle of being a spiritual person on, not just part of it. Let us pray. Let the hearts open. One thing about this process of being a mystic or to being a deeply spiritual person is we are confronted with our own stuff, and we care about the world. And they may cause what feels like suffering. But if we're willing, that suffering or that pain will be transformative. And we can do more with our lives. So let us ask, what in our world or what in ourselves needs to be healed? And feel into it. I'm sorry. Please forgive me. Thank you, and I love you. Let us feel more deeply into our commonality with all beings. So just as we can see ourselves in the beauty of the birds and the majestic mountains, let us also know that all that we see is within us. And see if we can love all of it. Let us send love in all directions without condition. Connect with all of existence without sense of separation. Let us be one with everything.